Hello, everybody. This short video provides an overview and analysis of Mary Shelley's famous novel, Frankenstein. Frankenstein is one of the most famous novels ever written, and the story of how Mary Shelley came up with the idea of writing it is almost as famous. In 1815, when she was still a teenager, she and her husband, the famous poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, were vacationing in the Alps with their friends, some of the leading artists and intellectuals of the period. During their vacation, they discussed the new science of electricity, speculated about the nature of the life force, and when a rainstorm kept them from being able to go out for walks, the friends decided that they would stay inside and make up scary stories to tell each other. Mary Shelley couldn't come up with a story right away, but that night she had a vivid dream that served as the kernel for what would become her masterpiece. She dreamed that a hulking, deformed, man-made man was looming over her bed in the night. Frankenstein's monster was born. If Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel, as many claim, it may be because of the mixture of influences that surrounded Mary Shelley during her Alpine vacation. Scientists and writers shared ideas in ways that suggested possibilities for merging their disciplines. Shelley invented a kind of fictional narrative that would let her think through the audacious scientific questions of the time that her friends had been discussing. On the one hand, the novelty of Shelley's story is a result of the fact that science, as a discipline separate from philosophy and theology, was relatively new in the early 1800s, so its appearance as an element in Shelley's story indicates the emergence of science, laboratory-based investigations and experimental approaches to the natural world, as a topic for discussion and inquiry into popular consciousness. But it is also the case that a cultural attitude has frequently existed that considers art and science to be separated along the same lines of Western epistemology that separate the soul from the body, or abstract ideas from concrete realities, or heaven from earth. The mixture of influences buzzing in Shelley's unconscious allowed these separate domains to combine with one another in a way that stitched science and fiction together into a new, surprising creation. One way of understanding the novel Frankenstein is to consider how Shelley adapted the conventions of Gothic fiction, a genre of literature that features haunted castles, frenzied emotions, and sinister demonic beings. In many ways, Frankenstein is a representative Gothic novel, with its hero, Victor, being haunted and menaced by a shadowy, unnatural, and violent being. Shelley's own father had written a similar Gothic story about a person who is stalked by a mysterious being who seems to represent the dark side of his own personality. But Shelley's twist is that Frankenstein's monster is not a supernatural ghoul. He is a product of science. Subsequent science fiction stories can be thought of as following this pattern of telling a Gothic story, only with techno-scientific entities taking the place of supernatural ones. But this substitution actually rewires the whole genre, because the world of sci-fi is not a dark fantasy from a bad dream, it is our world. The electrochemical forces that animate Frankenstein's monster are the same forces that animate our own bodies. Sci-fi in this sense is a Gothic of the real, in which supernatural forces are encountered not as other, but as reflective of our own identities and our own existential situation. In this way, science fiction narratives become a commentary on the techno-scientific future that we have been traveling into for the past 200 years, as well as a mirror into the nature of our own lives. Shelley begins her story with a frame narrative told through a series of letters by a Captain Walton to his sister. Captain Walton is the leader of an expedition that strives to travel farther toward the North Pole than any team has ever gone before, and his dangerous quest establishes the theme of how scientific investigation into the natural world can become an all-consuming and even demonic obsession. Walton writes, "How gladly I would have sacrificed my fortune, my existence, my every hope, to the furtherance of my enterprise. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race." Captain Walton's thirst for scientific discovery is not a mere abstract curiosity, but an ego-driven pursuit of godlike power that threatens to plunge himself and his crew into disaster. Walton's story introduces the moral value of science, the question of whether the pursuit of scientific inquiry may arise not from an abstract ideal of knowledge, but may be an expression of a dark, seductive, even suicidal impulse, the kind of impulse that Gothic fiction would have associated with the devil. Walton's grandiose statement about the aims of his polar mission is what inspires Victor Frankenstein to tell his story, supposedly for the purpose of warning the captain about how nature does not disclose her secrets without demanding something in return. The early chapters of Victor's story describe how he himself became obsessed with solving the mysteries of nature. His intellectual appetite was whetted on the writings of medieval alchemists who dreamed of performing magical achievements like turning lead into gold and concocting an elixir of eternal life. And these magical, some might say Gothic, motifs continued to inform his thinking as he turned his attentions to more modern scientific methods of dissection and lab experimentation. At the height of his enthusiasm for his studies, Victor exclaims, "So much has been done, more, far more, will I achieve. Treading in the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation." These words echo the ambitions Walton had articulated about his life project, and they both position the motivational force of scientific inquiry as something ghoulish and perverse in the human heart. This way of thinking about science is at odds with the prevailing intellectual attitude of the Enlightenment, which espouses the mind's power as a light against evil and chaos. On the other hand, the idea that science is demonic and unnatural is consistent with another line of thought, one that can be variously identified with Romanticism, Christianity, and New Materialism, that characterizes human intellect as an egoistic and self-destructive denial of the profound mysteries of God and nature that dwarf human beings' ability to understand them. For the next 200 years, science fiction stories would continue to warn their anti-heroes that they were meddling with forces they cannot possibly begin to understand. Victor's application of his advanced scientific pursuits leads to the creation and animation of his monster. In the 20th century, American movies popularized Frankenstein's monster as a dim-witted, inarticulate ogre. But aside from the large size and physical deformity, that is not Shelley's Frankenstein's monster, who spends many pages describing his life experiences in impeccable 19th century British prose. He is not inherently violent or deranged, but is, if anything, preternaturally sensitive and astute. When he finds himself created and abandoned in the world, he takes shelter in a hovel adjacent to a small cottage, and the monster comes to love and provide for the dear tragic family that lives there, with a height of sentiment that expresses the monster's perfect innocence and inherent goodwill and open-heartedness. That is to say that Victor has not made a monster. Not really. He's made a person. The real horror is not the monster's monstrosity, but his humanity. This is true in two ways. On one hand, the human monster is horrifying, because that means that just like a real human, it can become angry and disobedient and even violent, especially when they are victims of mistreatment, which of course is what happens to Frankenstein's monster. But on the other hand, the human monster is horrifying because it means that humanity itself is nothing more than a monster, a creature sewn together out of random carcasses and jolted to life with an electric spark. And maybe that even means that God himself is not all-knowing and benevolent, but just another irresponsible madman, or that there is no God at all, and that all of nature is a monstrous creature with no purpose, no soul. It may be reflections like this that cause Frankenstein to instinctively loathe his monster. On the night Victor brings his monster to life, he is so disturbed that he simply runs away into the night, ultimately abandoning his creature in a frenzied act of denial. Sure, the monster looks ugly, but Shelley makes it clear that if Victor had simply had some compassion for the creature, it could have responded in kind. But there is something about this scientific breakthrough that breaks Victor's mind, making him unwilling to acknowledge the consequences of his weird science. Eventually, the monster returns into Victor's life as the murderer of members of Victor's family, one of literature's most dramatic examples of what Freud called the return of the repressed. By this time, Victor has a lot of reasons to hate his monster, but his dread of the creature is always in excess of the monster's actual crimes. Victor hates his creature from the start, and he hates him for more and deeper reasons than just the murders of William, Henry, Justine, and Elizabeth. Even when the monster tells his story and begs for a companion, Victor remains committed to the belief that the monster is a fiend and deserves nothing other than total destruction. In fact, Victor's instinctive hostility to the monster is the first example of such cruelty that eventually turned the monster into a murderer by making him feel helpless and despised. That is another sense in which the monster is Frankenstein's monster. Victor made the creature in the lab, but Victor turned the creature into a monster by teaching him that he was hated and exiled from the human community. The monster's homicidal personality is therefore a kind of reflection of Victor's own darkness, and the monster's murderous rampage among Victor's loved ones exists as a personification of the destructive powers of Victor's scientific obsessions. Victor's hatred of the monster is a hatred of himself and his ultimate disavowal of the scientific principles he had so fervently believed in. It is Victor's own hatred, not the monster, that kills Victor. Victor dies pursuing the monster into the Arctic in a desperate quest that parallels Captain Walton's northward expeditions. Both men's obsessions have led them to the brink of death. When we meet up with Captain Walton at the end of the novel, his ship is in the midst of being crushed by pack ice, and he's trying to decide if he should turn around and head home or brave on in the face of looming destruction. Victor, at this point right at the brink of death from exhaustion and woe, rallies the sailors to carry on their glorious expedition. This is a strange thing to say, considering that his entire narrative has been a warning against this kind of scientific hubris, and so Shelley leaves a note of ambiguity in the story regarding how we should feel about scientific ambitions. The fact that Walton decides to turn the boat around and go home suggests that Victor's dying words are rightfully ignored and disregarded. But the monster stops by for a final chat with Captain Walton before going off into the wilderness to commit suicide, and his words suggest that for all his murderous ways, he may actually have a soul after all, and that maybe the final tragedy of Victor's tragic life is that he failed to perceive that what he created was actually beautiful. This final ambiguity leaves readers to work through their own interpretation of how the novel characterizes scientific investigation and technological achievement. The horror of Frankenstein can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It is the horror that technological advancement may doom the soul of the human race. The horror that science has banished God, faith, and the afterlife from the cosmos, leaving the modern subject alone and terrified in a hostile world. Horror that, even when we become aware that we are being stalked and immiserated by the monster of technoscience, there's nothing we can do about it. It is too powerful. It is too late. The horror that human life, our capacity for goodness and wonder, for love and aspiration, is merely the galvanic effect of so much voltage coursing through a mechanism of flesh. Since Mary Shelley wrote this novel, techno-scientific pursuits of ambitious young geniuses like Victor have concocted a large family of Frankensteinian innovations. Germ warfare, nuclear power, social media, AI, genetic modification, global capitalism, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. In each of these examples, it is easy to imagine how these brilliant products of human ingenuity could turn around to kill our families, stalk our nightmares, and steal our sanity. Many science fiction stories turn on the plot point that our Frankensteinian technological creatures may turn around to destroy us. The robots of the Terminator franchise, the replicants of Blade Runner, the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park all echo the warning implicit in Mary Shelley's Bad Dream. But in a way, every science fiction story is Frankensteinian, since Shelley was the first writer to teach us that storytelling could serve as a strategy for thinking through the complex new truths of our scientific era, embodying them in narrative and humanizing them in the voices and actions of fictional characters.